War and Revolution, Section. White War of Independence in the West and Colonial War in the East. In the years and decades preceding the outbreak of the Second 30 Years' War, the countries of the West all prided themselves on belonging to an exclusive family. In fact, a race, or family of races, destined to subjugate, quote, inferior races. It was a great race, an expansionist race, to use Theodore Roosevelt's terms, or an imperial race, in Macaulay's. A race variously defined as Nordic, Aryan, or Teutonic. It was almost universally admitted, wrote a respected British ethnologist in 1842, that the collective body of the European nations descended from the Aryan or the Indo-European race. Some decades later, a eulogist of British imperialism celebrated the British and Germans as the two main currents of the Teutonic race. In 1899, the British colonial secretary himself, Joseph Chamberlain, called upon the United States and Germany to enter into a Teutonic alliance with his country. Only with the First World War were such categories converted from a vehicle of unanimous self-celebration of Europe and the West, especially their leading countries, into tools of fratricidal struggle. With the USA's intervention in the war against Germany, the term Teuton lost the positive, celebratory connotation it had hitherto had in wide cultural and political circles, becoming an insult directed at the new enemies. This division of Europe, the West and the Aryan race, created bitter controversies and heartfelt regrets. The war raged, but there were German authors who regretted the spectacle of a bloody conflict between two sister nations of Germanic stock, on the one hand, and the fraternization of Indo-Germanic Great Britain with Mongol Japan on the other. Especially painful was the presence in the Entente's ranks, and worse still, among the troops occupying defeated Germany, of black soldiers, who were accused of a propensity for rape. Did the victor's vendetta extend to making mulattoes of the defeated? Protests against this unprecedented violation of white solidarity and racial and social hierarchy appealed to the whole civilized world and the Holy See. Beginning of long quote. With horror and disgust, Germany sees itself menaced in the purity of its blood. They are ruining the blood, ruining the purity of our blood, which for years will have to mix with the blood of more primitive races, and we shall become a population of mulattoes. We do not want to suffer such an affront. And given that the other European peoples have no sense of European solidarity in this matter, they do not see the danger threatening the whole of Europe should Germany be inhabited by a proletarianized, ungodly, half-caste population. End of long quote. The cry for pity by German women called for an immediate end to this kind of racial civil war. Quote, "With our heads veiled, we present ourselves to you, men and women of the white race. We open our broken hearts, so that you too will raise a voice of protest, which will be testimony to universal indignation at the race of brutes which, in debasing us, debases the world's entire white race." End quote. These were themes that also circulated widely on the other side of the Atlantic. Lothrop Stoddard, who rapidly achieved international notoriety and was lauded by two U.S. presidents, Harding and Hoover, deplored the White Civil War, or the New Peloponnesian War, of white civilization. It involved a fratricidal conflict which, destroying white solidarity and dismembering Europe in the first instance, the white homeland, the heart of the white world, amounted to white race suicide. Just as the American Civil War brought the enrollment of blacks in the Union's ranks, so the First World War had involved massive recourse to colored troops by the Entente. This division of the white, civilized world, with its abolition of the boundary between civilization and barbarism, was consummated by Bolshevism. engaged in constructing a global alliance with colonial peoples against the West and the whites, and inciting, quote, the rising tide of the peoples of color. It was to be regarded as, quote, the renegade, the traitor within the gates, who would betray the citadel, an arch-enemy of civilization and the race, end quote. Spengler reached the same conclusion, denouncing the burning hatred of Europe and white peoples, nurtured by the Bolsheviks, who were allies and, indeed, an integral part of the Earth's colored population. The German writer offered a historical reconstruction of this disastrous parabola. It began with Britain's recourse to the aid of the Native Americans in its struggle against the rebel colonists. This resumed a theme consecrated in the American Declaration of Independence. Continued with the French Jacobins' alliance with the blacks of Haiti in the name of the rights of man. Developed with the Entente's employment of colored troops, and finally culminated in the Bolshevik Revolution. Such themes and suggestions are active in Hitler, who, in Mein Kampf, set out a program of colonial expansion in the European East in an attempt to avoid a fratricidal conflict with Britain. Immediately after coming to power, he declared to a British reporter that the First World War had been a tragedy for the two great Germanic nations. A year later, speaking to another British journalist, the Führer expressed the idea that, quote, Germanic nations such as ours ought to be friends by sheer force of natural instinct. On the 4th of September 1937, the Daily Mail reported a letter by Hitler in which, having celebrated the historically unique colonial aptitude and the naval power of Britain, he desired an agreement between it and Germany, to be subsequently extended to the adhesion of the American nation, so as to hold high the banner and the interest of the white people. Some years earlier, the Nazi leader had defined a potential war between Germany and Great Britain, and between the Germanic nations in general as a, quote, racial crime. In similar fashion, Rosenberg sang the praises of the creative values and entire culture of the West, or Teutonic European values, threatened by racial chaos. Once he had failed to avert war in the West, the Führer largely respected the Jus Publicum Europaeum during the conflict with France. Repression of the partisan resistance, for the particular problems of international law it raises, would merit a separate discussion. From the outset, however, he theorized and practiced the war of extermination against the natives of the colonial empire he proposed to build. While he criticized the British, used, unlike the Germans, to going to war with foreigners and barbarians, for bombing cities and failing to respect the customs of chivalrous war, Hitler professed to attach no importance to a formal juridical end to the war on the Eastern Front. End quote. It was an explicitly colonial war against barbarians. After the conquest and colonization of the new territories, quote, we must meet a flood from Asia with a living wall. End quote. The sentiment of the unity of the Germanic nations that continued to inspire the Third Reich is the obverse of a racial contradistinction from the Orient. Equally, notwithstanding total war, the radical naturalistic despecification of the Asiatic enemy inhibited a naturalistic despecification of Western enemies, who were still situated within the ambit of civilization. At the war's close, Himmler surrendered to a racially akin enemy, the Anglo-Saxons, who had always formed part of the Nordic family of races. The Nazi ringleader was possibly under the illusion that he would meet with understanding. After all, it was in the East, on the natives, that the Third Reich had waged pitiless war. This attitude had a long history behind it. Reference has sometimes been made to a double standard in the American way of waging war, depending on whether the enemy were whites or Native Americans. This even manifested itself during the conflict between North and South. The violence that marked it is in no ways comparable to the contemporaneous extermination of rebellious native populations, even though they posed no real threat to the Union. The orders were unequivocal. No prisoners were to be taken. In the infamous Sand Creek Massacre of 1864, women and children were also killed. In reality, the double standard was a feature of the Western history as a whole. In America, it is immediately apparent only because the colonial populations were located within the metropolitan territory itself. The double standard celebrated its triumph with the Third Reich. The more or less chivalrous duel desired in the West, in the context of a persistent, deplorable white civil war, was inseparable from the colonial campaign of extermination against barbarians posted outside civilization. End section.